Hello and welcome back to these talks on the Exalted Treatise on the Response, the Tao. Today we'll be looking at this particular statement about the sovereign or subject or employer-employee relationship. Now remember that this section is about misconduct, the misdeeds that will lead to misfortune. So the line that we're focusing on today is the misdeed of defying one's superiors. So just like last week, when we explained how the idea of teachers and education at that time in China, Imperial China, was a bit different from what we think about teachers, the student-teacher relationship today. I'd also like to refer to some past literature about the sovereign-subject relationship. Now, even though it is about how relations were in the workplace at that point in time, I think it also gives us very good inspiration as to how we might behave towards our boss today. So rather than thinking about it as the ruler and subject relationship, we can think about it in terms of a team leader and team member or line manager and employee kind of relationship today. And how it is that we're meant to behave towards our manager or boss. And to explore these issues a bit more thoroughly, what it means to be an employee, what it means to defy your boss, I'd like to refer to a text called the Shuoyuan. And this was compiled by Liu Xiang in around the 1st century BCE. So it wasn't his work. He put together an anthology of over 700 different anecdotes, historical narratives that all related to statecraft. And fortunately, it's been translated very recently by Eric Henry. So that's what I'll be using today in the slides. I have made minor modifications, but essentially the translation is Eric Henry's. So interestingly, when we look at the Shuoyuan, the second chapter, also called the second book, is about the craft of an officer, in Chinese, 陈述. And as I said, this officer, the reason why we're looking at it is because in those days, a very important career option was being a government official. Now, these days, of course, when we think about jobs, there's a diversity of careers, but still we can substitute this word officer with any employee relationship. So workplace relations. Now, in order to fulfill your job requirements, you need to have the knowledge and the skills for your work. Well, that's a given. And I'm sure before we even apply for a job, we have to have the right qualifications. So what we're looking at here is not so much about the skills and the knowledge, but the other side of things, how to ensure that these relations go smoothly, that your workplace relations are harmonious rather than toxic, that you can have a good work life, and more importantly, career development and advancement. So this is what we mean by this humanistic education, this more holistic education about how to make our relations, throughout our lives. And we're focusing here on the workplace relations, particularly towards our boss, but how to make our relations meaningful. So beyond, the specific skills and knowledge set that you will need, how do you relate? And that's this idea of the craft of an officer. Craft in Chinese, 术, is also quite interesting. It originally meant path, a physical sort of path, and then took on derived meanings of a particular course of action, practices. So really here, when we talk about the craft of an officer, we're really talking about the conduct, the patterns of behavior that of a good employee, of an efficient, effective employee. So let's take a look at that now. It begins with a bit of an introduction as a summary. So this is the craft of someone who serves another is as follows. There's quite a few points that I'd like to elaborate on. First, this person generally complies with commands. Commands here really means instructions. So compliance is a willingness to learn, to take on tasks and follow instructions, which is generally part of our the requirements of our job. But this is also saying that, generally most of us will have something on our plate, particularly if, say, for example, you're working in some form of administration. There's a lot of things to do. And then all of a sudden your boss comes with more work. So this compliance is then to say, well, to be willing to take on this work. Now that doesn't mean that it's, we cannot refuse. Obviously, we have to be very clear about what the task is, what the instructions are, and also if there are things that are questionable, and if it's something unethical, then we also have to clarify that, and we'll come to that in the later section today. So compliance is generally this willingness to do the work, and despite your workload. The second point then is, well, you comply with these instructions, but you also then have to report back once you've done them, to report back on your progress. This sounds very easy, isn't it? But interestingly, not everyone does this. So why is that? Well, because if someone does report back on saying that the task is now finished, they'll get some more work, and they may not want that. So in order not to receive work, they might delay the reporting. So they will report, but they might delay the reporting. So let's take, for example, it's you finish the job midday, but you delay the reporting until maybe 4 o'clock in the afternoon. So you don't get any more tasks for the rest of the day. This is on a sort of micro level. Or for example, waiting until Friday afternoon before you tell them that you've finished. So you know that, you're not going to get anything else new that you have to think about over the weekend. So that would then be, this is an example of why, reporting on one's performance might be delayed or hindered, because you're thinking about getting more time to yourself. The other point about reporting is one's attitude. When we report back, what's our attitude? Is it so that we can boast about the work that we've done? We expect some sort of praise, a promotion or pay rise? Or is it more sort of reporting back on the progress so that you seek feedback, so that you can improve yourself, and then ultimately take on more work? So that attitude is also quite important when we report. And ultimately then, what are we reporting on? I said before, we report back on our progress, but there are certain milestones. So we don't have to report on every single detail. Like, I just sent this email, I'm waiting for a response. Just report back when you get a response. So be mindful of the communication that you give to your boss, because there's a lot of communication that they're getting from everyone else across the organization. So reporting back on significant progress is the key. And then, of course, it's easy to report on good news, but what if there is some sort of criticism or feedback that is not so positive? So it is also important to make sure that this is reported back or communicated in a timely fashion. And so this reporting on performance, whether it might be excellent performance or you feel that your performance was not up to standard, is all of that reporting needs to be done in a timely fashion. The third point here is does not presume to reserve decisions for themselves. So the idea here then is to act within the limits of your authority and to make sure you know what you need to do in your role and how much authority you've been delegated, and then seek approval and permission for other things outside that designated authority. So how much initiative you can take really depends on how much you've been delegated. But actually, that also depends on how much you have proven yourself to be worthy of delegated authority. So despite the fact that it says here that, you shouldn't make decisions for yourself, you should always ask for approval, seek permission, in reality, you can take initiative. You can take initiative by seeking out information that you know is necessary to help your manager make that decision. So gather the information, ask the questions, as if you yourself were making the decision. What information would you need? Or what is it that your manager always asks for? These certain reports, certain investigations, etc., that need to be done. And, if you provide all of that information, then they can quite quickly approve the decision, and so much so that they trust you to make the judgment. Now, of course, there's good reason also why these high-level decisions are made by the management, and that's because oftentimes the decision affects the entire organization, and perhaps we only have a very limited understanding or perspective. We don't have the bird's eye view of what's happening overall or what's happening between organizations and in the market. So it's important to reserve decisions and ensure that the right person is asked to approve. And that then also relates to the next part. It says here, they act from principle rather than convenience. So it's always, this convenience is that, it's always easy to go along with someone, to agree with someone. But actually, if you think that based on the principle, now what's the principle? The principle is what we've been learning in the Exalted Treatise, but in other sort of texts of the ancient Chinese traditions, the principle is how it should relate to not just ourselves or the leader, but to the organization as a whole and to the community as a whole. So yes, others in the organization, your manager, other managers might think of a particular strategy, and it's convenient for us to then go along with those ideas. But this idea of acting from principle is, if you feel that it is against principle, then it's important to gather the information and provide a different perspective. Have you considered it this way? What if we, change this aspect of the strategy to make sure that you are able to provide that perspective and from principle? So that's what it means here, that do you think about the principle, or do you just act based on the fact that you want to clock off at the right time, you don't want to do more work than necessary, or you don't want to risk being unpopular? And then finally, this employee, the craft of this employee, very efficient employees, not to exalt their own position. In other words, not to inflate their own authority. So you're designated a specific task, you do that, make decisions seeking approval first, but also a very typical example of someone who might exalt or inflate their own position is when they make things difficult for others. So, for example, a secretary, right? The secretary's responsibility is to ensure that there's open channels of communication between themselves, the others, and the boss. So, for example, the secretary to the manager. But if this particular secretary decides to inflate their own authority, then they might be selective in the communication that they pass on. And if you're not their friend or their part of their group, then your communication may be delayed or even not communicated at all. So this is when you inflate your own authority. And if you sense that, some of these you may recognize in your own workplace, but it's not so important to judge others. It's more important to reflect on whether you do this yourself, whether, if given that particular position, you decide to then use and abuse that power. So this is important to reflect. And then one's actions should always be beneficial to the state. So here, because they are government officials, it's talking about how their work would benefit the country or the domain as a whole. But today in our modern workplace, it would be to how it benefits the organisation as a whole and the community, as well as being helpful to one's superiors, the managers and management. Which then, obviously, if it's helping the organisation, it would be helpful to them. And it says, hence great honour accrues to him and to their sons and grandsons. So this respect naturally comes about if you do your job in the right way. And not only to this respect for yourself, this honour, but also to your sons and grandsons. And that's because in those days, if you did your job well, you would be bestowed a particular territory or title or rank. And that particular title and territory, that salary, would also then be passed on to your descendants. So that's why it says here this idea of sons and grandsons or descendants. But really, in today's world, we would say, well, if someone is quite distinguished in their work, they're quite celebrated, quite eminent in their field, then it's likely that if their children also decide to pursue that career, they would also be afforded some respect as well. So there are many ideas here that helps us today. And you can see, of course, that if we can fulfill all of these points as part of our jobs, we would be quite efficient and effective. But then on the other hand, if you don't do this, then this would be defying your superior, right? So when we read that particular line in the Exalted Treatise, we think, oh, okay, well, defying one's superiors is simply to refuse them, criticize them, talk back. But actually, there are many nuances, as you can see here, implying, and I've written it here from a modern point of view, which is, to take tasks on board, this idea of communication and reporting, taking the initiative, but also seeking approval when necessary, prioritizing, the right principle over personal convenience of just agreeing, and then fulfilling responsibilities without inflating one's authority. Now, the rest of this, the passage in the Shuoyuan, then goes on to provide us with even more detailed understanding of what a very effective and successful employee would do, and sort of breaks it down to 6 effective patterns of behavior and 6 ineffective, what they call perverse patterns of behavior. So that's why that says here there are 6 proper behaviors and 6 perverse behaviors. And if we are able to abide and observe the proper behaviors, these patterns of working, then we will be respected, we will be distinguished in our work, we will attain career advancement. But if we don't, and instead we do the 6 improper behaviors, then well, naturally you will suffer shame. So this is very much in keeping with the ideas in the Exalted Treatise, that this idea of good fortune and misfortune are not random, that good fortune and misfortune come about because of what we do and what we think. And that's exactly what it's saying here. So we have to make sure that we're following the right behaviors, the modes of behavior. And let's look at them now. So each of them are quite interesting. It's only a very short paragraph. And at the end it says, such a one is a type of officer. But really, as I mentioned, these are all modes of behavior, patterns of behavior. So this would be sagely behavior. So they're not 6 different types of people, like, A-type personalities, B-type personalities. They're actually, depending on the situation we find ourselves in, or depending on which manager we're talking to, the CEO versus the director, etc., then perhaps how we behave towards them will be different. So each of these 6 behaviors would be applicable to our own workplace life, work life. So the first here is someone who is quite sagely, in the sense that they're able to foresee what's going to happen. And this, I guess, comes about through one's experience, so applying one's learning, but also through very detailed understanding of cause and effect of the ideas in these ancient texts. And it's about sort of understanding the broader perspective, and not just simply what's happening in my life as an employee or the employer, but the greater picture, the bigger picture. So just as an example, we have in the Analects a conversation between Confucius and one of the key leaders of the state of law at that time. And being an important minister, Ji Kangzi asked Confucius about how to go about governing, because Confucius was known to be someone who was very erudite, very learned in the ancient ways, and therefore was sought after for his advice. And so Confucius here replies, how to govern? Well, government is none other than to rectify, which is a play on the Chinese words. In Chinese, 正者正业. So the 2 words sound the same. To govern and to rectify sound the same. And Confucius is trying to say, well, to govern means to rectify oneself, to cultivate oneself. Because if you are cultivated as the leader, then everyone will follow your example. And they themselves will be cultivated, and therefore society will become ordered. So there we have a very sort of that Confucian political perspective of a society that's not just ordered through economic means, but through that kind of moral character education that we talked about last week. So here you can see that Confucius could have responded in many ways. If Ji Kangzi asked another person about, okay, well, how do I go about my government? Another official might say, well, everything that you're doing is fine. What you're doing is just perfect. Just keep doing what you're doing because you're the best leader. But obviously Confucius didn't say that, and he didn't mention sort of economic means or other methods. He talked about the cultivation of the leader, and this is in many ways thinking about the bigger picture. And this is what's going to cause the main causal factor of success and failure for the entire government as well as the order of society. And it's different from just simply certain policies or certain strategies that the leader might take. We see here that Confucius is providing this wise advice. Another anecdote that we find in the Shuo Yuan itself is also around this period in China, in which Chen Chenzi, who is the leader of the state of Qi, asked one of his ministers, well, how is it that you will serve me? How can you be a minister that is loyal to me? This person says, well, strangely says, if you die, I'm not going to die. And if you go into exile, in other words, if you were banished for some reason by the people, then I'm not going to follow you. And Chen Chenzi, hearing this, says, then how is it that you serve me if you're not even going to follow me in times of thick and thin, right? We think about loyalty as being faithful to someone through the tough times as well as the good times. So Chen Chenzi is asking, well, how does that make you a loyal official? And so the reply is that it's in the prevention, isn't it? That as an official, my role is to prevent these scenarios from happening in the first place, right? So my role is to make sure that the government policies are such that will not make you unpopular with the people, will help the people develop and grow and be prosperous. And in such cases, you will not be facing death or banishment from the country. So obviously, in those days, people would be exiled or banished if they were committed a gross injustice and considered harmful to the state. They would have to leave the state. And this would even happen to leaders. But obviously, the good official, the good employee would think ahead. Okay, so what is it that will cause, that will lead to successful policies, peaceful and prosperous society versus, negative policies, and let's follow those. So steering the ship in the right direction before it makes before the leader makes very difficult, dire mistakes in their policies. So that's that idea of providing this sagely advice so that the leader then is well respected and well loved. That's one pattern of behavior, to think ahead for one's manager and leader. The second pattern of behavior, which is described here as being an honest official, is to provide the right counsel. And this counsel is in relation to virtue. So we talked about how, from the Confucian perspective at least, but even from the Taoist perspective, that we have certain virtues, right? That the idea of propriety and rightness here are innate to us. And we need to ensure that we follow these positive tendency towards the good. So this kind of officer then will be quite aware of ensuring that in themselves they provide the right example of these virtues, and they will encourage and educate the ruler to do the same, to follow the virtuous tendencies rather than just think of their own enjoyment. So this is quite well illustrated by the following story between Yanzi and his ruler, Lord Jing of the state of Qi. Now, Yanzi was a particularly famous statesman who lived in around the 5th century BCE, and he was high-level minister and ultimately became the chancellor, so the highest government position in the state. So it says here on one of the days when Yanzi was in attendance, so he was probably talking about the government affairs with Lord Jing. The ruler tells him, can you bring me in some dishes? And Yanzi replies by saying, no, I'm not going to do that because I'm not really your waiter. Then Lord Jing says, can you bring me in some furs? In other words, it's getting cold. I need these clothes. And Yanzi replies, well, no, again, I'm not in that role. I'm not the person who goes and hunts and gets hunts the animals and extracts their hides and furs so that you can have these clothes. And by this time, the ruler is getting quite upset. He's refused to do even some simple things that I've asked him to do. So what is it that you do exactly? So then Yanzi replies that I serve the altars of the grain and soil. So in those days, the altars of the grain and soil means the spirits of the grains and the spirit of the earth or the soil, which were sacrificed to or commemorated as by the ruler in order to help them remember that these were the most important things, that without the earth, without this agriculture, then the people will not be fed. Without the grain, the people will not be fed. And that's the most important thing, to think about the people. So the altars of the grain and soil ultimately are then a metaphor for the state and for the people. And so Yanzi replies that he serves the state. And by this time, Lord Jing is even more perplexed. Well, if you're serving the state, then you really should be serving me. So what do you mean? And then Yanzi says that, one who serves the state is able to ensure that everything in government is in order. So all of the different positions, the ministers, the nobility, as it says here, or the officers, their ranks, you have to make sure that everyone in office is appropriate for their particular capacities, that they're being remunerated in the right amount, and they're in the right position, in accordance with their aptitude, so that they can really provide the best for the government. They're in the right position, right time, right place, and they can contribute in the maximum effect. He's saying, there's a lot of things I need to think about, all of the human resources of the state, as well as also ensuring about the nobility, so the noble families, ensuring that they are in order, as well as also ensuring that the directives and the decrees that you have as the ruler are then communicated to everyone that needs to know. And here it says all quarters of the state, so that your directives, your instructions are promulgated, you could say. And you can see, of course, that work is already quite substantial. So bringing in the dishes or some clothes is not really his job as chancellor. So this is quite a funny story because in some ways you think, well, Yanzi doesn't have to be too particular. He could have just taken in some of the dishes. But actually, this was about educating the ruler, as we said before, educating him about, well, this is my role description. This is what I have to do, and this is what you have to do. You shouldn't be thinking just about, food or what you wear. You should be thinking about the state. You should be thinking about the people. So this is in a very intelligent way, I guess, in which Yanzi reminded and educated his leader about what was important, and making sure that the leader is always focused on the what is important, which is the people. So this is this idea of the honest official. the official who's always thinking about, okay, how can we help the leader cultivate their own virtues and improve how they work as the leader, as the ruler. This, as it says, enlarge the ruler's understanding, the good inclinations as opposed to the negative inclinations about self-interest and indulging oneself. Now, the third pattern of behavior, as it says here, is loyalty. But let's look at what this means. So this idea of being modest, being humble, but also at the same time being diligent. And always thinking about how it is that you can benefit the government, not only through your own capacities, but recommending others who might also have that skill set as well and virtue. The other thing here is to refer to past policies and decisions. So these are sort of exemplary policies in the past to remind one's manager about what's been done and the gold standard, so that the standards are raised. And of course, that involves educating oneself first before you are able to provide such advice, doesn't it? So this is the idea of a loyal officer. And again, here it refers to the altars of the state. The idea of the state is the number one priority for this officer. And again, there's this particular anecdote, I think, that's quite, that illustrates as well. And it's a discussion about a particular officer, Wu Zisheng, who's been serving Zhao Jianzi, one of the key ministers and another leader of the state of Qi, for quite some time. And it says here that, yes, he's been in this job for a long time, but it's interesting how he continues to be quite favoured, because oftentimes you might be favoured for a short period of time but then fall out of favour. So why is it, and how has Wu Zisheng been able to maintain this favour? And the answer is that, this particular person, he's very erudite, he's got this great experience and abilities, but at the same time he remains modest and humble. So yes, when he is in favour, obviously what he does, he's very diligent, he's quick to respond, but he doesn't get ahead of himself and become arrogant. And then when the ruler doesn't ask for advice, probably neglects him, then at the same time he remains respectful to that ruler without any sense of resentment. The fact that, now you've neglected my advice, etc., but I'm still respectful. When in court, he thinks about the state, but also when he's away from court, he's still very humble. So in the sense that, he doesn't carry that chip on his shoulder that he's provided personal advice to the leader. He's enjoyed the favour of Zhao Jianzi. But actually, when he's away from the court, he's just like anyone else, any other official, and he doesn't sort of have airs. So that's why he's been successful for so long. And on top of that, when he is rewarded, he's actually declines these gifts and these rewards because he's quite content and doesn't take more than his fair share. And then as a result, he's been able to continue for such a long time in Zhao Jianzi's service. So this is that idea of being that very diligent officer that, regardless of whether you are in favour or out of favour, you still maintain that modesty, that humility, and you're still able to respect your leader. The fourth pattern of behaviour is to be very careful and cautious in one's observation of matters. So it says here that, being able to see the early warning signs. This is a bit different from the very first pattern of behaviour, which was about, being sagely and being understanding the big picture and the factors for success and failure. This is about the idea of picking up on these symptoms and ensuring that you take timely action to avoid disaster and difficulty for your government and for your leader. And a very interesting story comes from the 1st century BCE about a senior minister, Bingzi. And there's one time when Bingzi is outside, he's riding in his carriage, and he comes across a group of people who are having a brawl on the streets. So they're sort of fighting, some people quite wounded as well as a result of this brawl. But he doesn't stop. He continues. He's in his carriage. He doesn't ask any questions about that. Doesn't even look at it. And then he comes to. He encounters a sort of a farmer who's, herding a group of his ox, right? And he notices that the ox are gasping for air. It's quite difficult for them to breathe for some reason. And he asks his driver to stop and get out of the carriage, and sort of has a conversation, finds out what's happening with the ox, takes his time before he then returns to the carriage. And this is very interesting for the driver, who is quite curious. Why is it that he didn't stop when there were obviously people injured on the side of the street, but he stops to ask about the ox? Right? This is quite an interesting question. So he can't. So this driver says, "Well, why? Why was it that you didn't care about the people, but you care about these animals?" And Bingzi then explains that if there's some sort of civil disorder, people injured, well, then this is the responsibility of the district governor, you'd say, and obviously the local policeman, right, in that area. It's not a matter for a minister. But when I saw the ox gasping for breath, it seems like it could be something related to changes in the weather pattern, right? At that time, it was early spring, so it wouldn't have been quite hot. And really, they shouldn't have been like that if they were just walking a short distance. So as a result, I needed to investigate to see where they'd been walking from, what track they'd been taking, and whether it was actually the result of some changed weather pattern. And why that's important is because if there are changes in the weather pattern, then it means that that might have an effect on the crops and therefore the harvest. And if the harvest is affected, then people may be starving. And we need to mobilize the granaries and make sure that this is distributed to areas that might not have enough food so that people don't starve. So you can see that Bingzi is able to, as a minister, thinking about the ramifications of a very small early warning sign that something could be amiss in terms of weather patterns, and therefore the need to take further steps to prevent famine and deaths from that famine. So these obscure matters. Now, we're not necessarily government officials, but at the same time, in every organization, there are sort of, in our particular areas of responsibility in our jobs, we need to be aware of things that happen and early warning signs as well, whether it's in our workplace, whether it's in our matters, and be alert to that and alert others, our managers, to these signs, so that say future disasters or future difficulties can be averted. The fifth aspect of being an effective and successful employee is to be, law-abiding, obviously, but also this idea of renouncing stipends. And really, this is not so much to say that you don't want a salary. It's about taking your fair share and not more than that. This also then relates to, even here it says dress and food, which was very important in those days because, depending on what rank or title you were in the government, your rank, your position, that would affect, your, let's say, your livelihood, what uniform you wore, and also even the number of dishes that you ate or something like that. So not everyone eats like the ruler or the king. And it'd be a problem if that was the case, with that kind of extravagance. So as an officer, even as a senior officer, one cannot have the same, treatment or property as the ruler. And again, I turn to a interesting anecdote about Yanzi. And there's literally an anthology of anecdotes about him and his interesting conversations with the rulers. But one day, it says that he came to court, and Yanzi was known for being, as we said, an effective statesman, but also very frugal. So in his own life, he wore, I think, his own fur coat, a winter coat, for about 30 years. And you can see the level of his, that kind of frugality and making sure that he doesn't spend extravagantly and wastefully. So this is also the same in terms of his means of transport. His carriage was also quite run down and pulled by some old horses. And obviously when his ruler sees this, Lord Xing feels quite, you could say, quite curious, why am I not giving you enough money in your salary? Why is it that you're using such old equipment? You could say, driving an old car. Yanzi replies by saying, well, no, not at all. What you've given me is more than adequate. All of my family, so branches of my family, so the different lines of my family, including aunties, uncles, etc., are well looked after, and they all depend on me for their livelihoods, my salary. But all I need really is just some warm clothes, the 3 meals a day, right? And this carriage to take me to court. That's all I need. I don't need any more than that. But Lord Xing feels that, perhaps this is a reflection on himself. If people see his own chancellor driving around in, say, an old car, then, it means that he's not a good official, he's not a good boss in giving enough salary. So what he does is he gets another official to deliver a new carriage, handsome carriage, and a team of 4 horses, so, very strong horses, to Yanzi. But Yanzi didn't accept. So what happens? Lord Xing is very annoyed. He summons Yanzi and says, if you're not going to accept the gift, then I'm not going to ride in my carriage either. In other words, this is a bit of a threat, sort of saying, you have to do what I say. I've given you the gifts, you have to accept. But Yanzi replies, again, by trying to educate his leader by saying, this is my job. You've ordered me to direct all the officials and set, but at the same time, I have to set a good example. So how I live, what I wear, what food I eat, then this is an example not only for the officials, but also for all the people. And, even as I am now, I'm still worried that they will be extravagant. They're not going to necessarily listen, and also be indulgent. Now, if, for example, I accept your great gift of a new carriage, fine team of horses, then I'm going to be riding around like the leader, like the ruler, like yourself. And as a result, then everyone below me will also want to do the same. And before long, everyone in the state will also be looking out for fine clothes and fine food and better means of transport, and that's where their energies will be directed. That's what they will focus on, when really they should be focusing on their work and focusing on doing, being diligent in what they have to do, rather than living a lavish lifestyle. So he says that as a result, because I want to set the right example, then I'm not going to accept your gift. I'm going to continue living my life in this frugal way. And in this way, he wins the argument. But you can see, of course, that Jens is, in every sort of, in these interactions that he has with the ruler, at every step of the way, he's trying to educate through his own example, through his words and his actions, what it is that the ruler should be focusing on in their lives. So not by refusing the gift is not to just say that one is quite incorruptible and honest, but there's also a reason to that, to make sure that as a chancellor, he's setting the right example. And then finally, this idea of being an upright officer. It says the above are the 6 proper behaviours of an officer. So times of turmoil and disorder. So the last behaviour is that, in times of despair and disorder, which often occurs when the ruler doesn't accord with the way, then there's still a need not to just give up, but to try one's best to provide honest feedback. So here, doesn't shirk, doesn't, give up on discussing the faults and errors of their leader, taking the risk, even braving the threat of punishment, etc., and then having no regrets. And this person is an upright officer. So this is, you can see here the various details of being someone who serves another, and that it's not as simple as saying, okay, well, we'll just listen to what they say all the time. There are sort of finer details to that. Think about the long term, the bigger picture, their particular cultivation, their virtue, setting the right example oneself, and also in times of trouble, making sure that you don't give up and you are also stand up for the right position, even though it might be unpopular. And now we turn to the 6 so-called improper behaviours, which I'll go through in the last few minutes that we have, because they're also quite interesting, but as you'll see, they have a common denominator. So here it says someone who just thinks about themselves, right? Thinks about their own profit, their own private prosperity, accumulating and appropriating funds for themselves and neglecting their actual work and their organization, in this case, government. He keeps his wisdom to himself and hides his abilities. Now, why would they do that? Because most people, they would want to show off the fact that they have great ideas. Well, let's take a very simple example. If they are appropriating funds, then they're not going to have the good idea of auditing the accounts, which is a very important idea, isn't it? But so obviously they're wanting to protect their own interests, and also on top of that, they don't want to do more work than they need to. So even if they have a bright idea, they're going to keep it hidden, rather than allowing the ruler to have good strategies. So this is a person that does their work quite carelessly and neglectfully. So therefore, it's called a perfunctory officer. So you can think about it. All of these 6 different patterns of behavior would be defying their superior, defying the boss in different ways. So this one is, everything the ruler says is great. Okay, everything that they say, yes, that's fine, that's the best idea ever. And they will also secretly think about what the ruler likes and find ways to ensure that they get what they want, and therefore they are distracted from their daily work. So they're just indulging themselves. And obviously this is to keep them in the good books and good favors. This is a sycophantic officer. And as we said before, obeying with commands is not really the be-all and end-all. Complying with commands or instructions is not just to do them. There's different, you could say there's differences here. So to obey commands that benefit the leader and obviously the state is obedience. That's quite clear. But if you obey the commands and it harms them, then that's not good, is it? So that's connivance. And you can actually disobey commands to benefit your ruler, and that's called being loyal. So that even with disobeying the commands. And if you disobey the commands to harm their ruler, which harms the ruler, that's called insubordination. And see, the main thing here is not to obey or disobey, but it's to think about the long-term consequences. Does it benefit or does it harm them? And if you're thinking about their benefit, which is obviously then the benefit of the state and the government, then this is positive. This is in accordance with what you should be doing as an employee, as a subordinate. Okay, the third pattern of behavior then is dishonesty. So everything that you're thinking about is about, creating your own alliances. Might seem on the surface that this person is really hardworking, they're very eloquent, ingratiating, but actually inwardly they're thinking only of getting rid of people who are better than them. And then as a result, whenever they talk to the leader, they only talk about the strengths of people they like, and obviously don't talk about their weaknesses. And for the people they don't like, they only talk about their weaknesses and not their strengths, which then leads their leader to employ people inappropriately, right, in the wrong jobs, simply because this person, it's their friend. So this idea of dishonesty is also very damaging because the government would be staffed by really just their friends and associates. The fourth kind of behavior is when someone uses their intellect to actually create divisions, again, for their own interests. They use their intellect, they use the gift of the gab, what they say, to argue their way out of things, right? And as a result, it's not about creating harmony, but creating disharmony, so that there are factions and they're able to then take advantage of the situation for themselves. So again, so quite a negative pattern of behavior. Fifth, the idea of monopolizing and abusing power. So this is quite blatant now. Before, the other patterns of behavior were more about, perhaps thinking about oneself, but not necessarily mobilizing power. But here it is, as it says, this kind of officer just twists the laws to magnify their own position, their own authority, enriching themselves, and forming private factions. So you can start to sort of think about your own workplace and whether this actually happens, that these profiles of certain people. But as I said, more importantly, to reflect on yourself and see whether or not you have these thoughts. And finally, this is probably the worst kind of behavior. It ruins the state. So yes, you do all these things as before. You think about just distracting the ruler with what their material desires, what they want. What they do then becomes quite unprincipled. You surround them with people who will not give them any honest advice. And then you should ultimately then shift all the responsibility for poor policy, etc., onto the ruler, which then means that they take the fall and the blame for everything, and therefore lose the confidence of the people, the public, and this then leads to ruining the state. So, as it says here, the six were the worthy officer, the effective, you could say, the effective and the successful employee will adhere to the 6 proper behaviors. So the 6 patterns of behavior that were about thinking about the state and the government and the leader, whereas the 6 perverse behaviors, as I went through quite quickly, the common denominator is just thinking about one's own self-interest and, not the leader, not the state, or the people. And if we are able to perform our tasks with these 6 proper patterns of behavior in mind, then there's going to be quite good structure and order, regardless of those who are our managers or those who are our subordinates. We will attain respect and also be honoured after we leave the position, and even, as it says here, in death. And this is the craft of an officer. So we then come back to the very first passage, which sort of says, okay, well, they should comply, they should report. You can see that in each one of these main points, there are different ideas, isn't it? So complying is not necessarily blindly obeying, but to also think of the consequences. And I guess the last thing I want to leave you with is to then challenge you to think about it, not just as the employer-employee relationship, but what about in all the other relationships we have in our lives? So, for example, as a child, do we think about our parents and just simply satisfying whatever they want? Or do we actually think about their cultivation and helping steer them in the right direction, guiding them as well, in the right way, in the right time? And do we then report back on what we do? Do we, are we willing to help out, etc.? So this can also help us reflect on the parent-child relationship, on how we deal with friends even, and whether we're willing to think about their interests as well, and act on principle rather than simply convenience. So all of these different points, very well illustrated in the Shuoyuan, this book to Craft of an Officer, helps us come to grips with, what it means to defy one's superior. To defy one's superiors, then to do all of those 6 improper behaviors, and to really be there for one's superior, to work together with your leader to ensure the success of the whole organization, and ultimately will lead to your own career development, is therefore to adhere to the 6 positive and proper behaviors. So I'll leave you with that thought, and next week we'll discuss how one relates to students or teaching others, but also then how to relate to colleagues and classmates. Okay, so look forward to seeing you next week. Thank you very much.